Welcome back everyone. In today's video we're talking about Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, published in 1866. If you watch my Best Reads of 2019, then you'll already know that I really enjoyed this book and I can't wait to talk about it. Part 1. Synopsis. Crime and Punishment focuses on the mental anguish and moral dilemmas of Rodion Raskolnikov, an impoverished ex-student in St. Petersburg who formulates a plan to kill an unscrupulous pawnbroker for her money. Before the killing, Raskolnikov believes that with the money, he could liberate himself from poverty and go on to perform great deeds. However, once it is done, he finds himself racked with confusion, paranoia, and disgust. His ethical justifications disintegrate completely as he struggles with guilt and horror and confronts the real-world moral consequences of his deed. Part 2. A Chronicle of Crime and Guilt. The thing that I enjoyed most about this novel was the way that it portrayed the committing of a crime and then the psychological effects that the committing of a terrible crime like murder would have on the villain. The novel itself is split into 6 parts, and each of these parts deals with a distinctive aspect of committing the crime and then various kind of stages of justification, disintegration of that justification, psychosis, all the various things that come with committing a crime and then feeling guilty about it. That first part especially, where Raskolnikov is psyching himself up to commit the crime, just has some of the most tense, brooding prose that I've ever read. Dostoevsky in this first part sets up various motivations for Raskolnikov and why he committed the crime. First of all, he's incredibly poor, and he may even be malnourished and possibly mentally ill from the state of degradation that he's living in. But then he also has some family drama going on. His sister plans to marry this businessman called Luzhin, who Raskolnikov thinks is only really interested in her for his own gain, his own selfish gain, and she only really seems to be interested in him as a means to get money to secure Raskolnikov's future education. Raskolnikov himself also has a strange fever dream in this first part, which is incredibly brutish and scary, and this again adds to the sense of maybe he's just committing this crime out of insanity, maybe he's committing this crime to protect his sister so she doesn't have to go to this marriage, and, as we'll see later on in the book, when he rationalizes his crime, he also subscribes to a very strange moral ideology which he thinks gives him the justification for killing this old woman. So Dostoevsky is just doing so much in that first part to make you as a reader unsure of why this crime is being committed. Also, the build-up to the crime itself. He does that in such a way where you believe for a moment that Raskolnikov is going to... his plan that he executes in his head it will all work, and then something will go wrong later. But literally everything that could go wrong with the murder goes wrong with the murder, and then you have this incredibly tense aftermath where he's almost caught several times and gets away by the scrape of his neck. If any of you are writers out there and you want to learn how to craft an incredibly tense, incredibly dramatic scene, then you should definitely read this novel, and in particular that first part, because it's just amazing. And there's also a scene later on which also has a very similar sort of setup. Dostoevsky is really good at creating that kind of thrilling atmosphere, keeps you on the edge of your seat as you're reading it, and keeps the pages turning. Part 3. Hordes of colourful characters. In addition to the main plot that follows Raskolnikov and his crime and the punishment, there are also a lot of B-plots going around, and a lot of very well fleshed out characters involved in those B-plots. One that particularly stands out to me is the one between Svidrigailov, who is a libertine, sort of villain-type character, and Raskolnikov's sister Dunya. Svidrigailov has a rather disturbing obsession with Dunya, and there's a whole plot surrounding that obsession, which builds into, again, another incredibly tense climactic scene. Also, there's the character of Porfiry, who is the detective who investigates the murder of the old woman, and he is, if any of you have watched Columbo, the detective series, he's definitely that kind of detective. He comes across as bumbling and stupid, but is actually incredibly smart, and it's great to watch him toying with Raskolnikov as he knows that the crime's been committed, and he's just trying to goad him into confessing as the novel goes along. The conversations that these two men have, Raskolnikov and Porfiry, are some of the best conversations in the whole novel. Porfiry has some wonderful encounters with Raskolnikov, and it's great as a reader because you know that Raskolnikov is the villain. You can kind of sense that Porfiry knows this as well, so when he's kind of goading Raskolnikov, you know what's going on, and it's great to watch that. In the same way with Columbo, it's great to watch him goad these criminals into confessing, and as the audience you're in on the joke, if you like. If there's one character though that I do think lets the novel down a bit, it's the character of Sonia, who is a love interest for Raskolnikov, and this ties into something that I'm going to get onto into the next part. But I will say briefly here, the reason for this is that Sonya's role in the story is very much to just be a salvation for Raskolnikov, and she doesn't really come across as someone particularly well fleshed out herself. This, like I said, leads me to the one part of the story that I really don't like, and lets it down a little bit, but not too much because I think it's great. Part 4, a morality tale. So this might be a recurring theme on my channel. It's something that I mentioned in my review of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, but I really do not like moralizing in any form of art. But unfortunately, Crime and Punishment does have one of these messages. If Crime and Punishment was just a story about the effects of the conscience on someone who's committed a crime, then it would be incredibly accurate in terms of the way it depicts it. It'd be great, it'd be perfect. But unfortunately, Dostoevsky doesn't stop there. He has to add in this moral lesson. To understand this, we'll have to get into a little bit of the background of the novel. Crime and Punishment is somewhat of a reaction to certain radical moral theories that were floating around in Russia at the time, especially at the universities. In a letter to his publisher, Dostoevsky describes his novel as being about a young man who yields to certain strange, unfinished ideas, yet floating in the air. The ideas that Dostoevsky is referencing here are moral theories of utilitarianism, which is a moral theory where what is morally good is about what brings the most pleasure and happiness to the most people, and what is morally bad are the things that bring the most pain and suffering to most people. He also is rejecting rationalist theories of ethics, which try and build morality out of reason and logic, rather than, say, appealing to God or religion. Dostoevsky, as a Christian, is against both of these moral theories because he thinks they can cause terrible harm, and, as Raskolnikov shows, they certainly can. One of Raskolnikov's justifications for killing the old woman is a utilitarian argument. He says that he could bring more pleasure to the world by killing the old woman, who is described as mean and horrible, terrible person. He can kill her, take her money, and give that to people, say the needy, and then he would bring about more pleasure to those people, and it kind of offsets the badness and the pain of killing this old woman. Dostoevsky is certainly against that moral justification, and he wants to show that by giving us the story of Raskolnikov, who commits this crime for these reasons, and then suffers the consequences because he feels guilty about it. The idea, it seems to me, is that because Raskolnikov feels this guilt, his moral theory must be wrong. Because if his moral theory was right, then he shouldn't be feeling guilt for killing the old woman, but he does, and Dostoevsky's thought is that you can't get religion out of utilitarian ethics or rationalization. It's something that has to come from God. Now, I actually think that this whole kind of philosophical argument is interesting, and I do agree with it as someone who doesn't really like utilitarian ethics. Although I also don't really like Christian ethics either. However, where I think the novel goes wrong is not so much in portraying Raskolnikov as someone who takes these radical moral views seriously and then commits a crime. It's more in the moralization that comes at the end of the novel in the epilogue, where Raskolnikov suddenly has a conversion to Christianity. The problem I have with moral novels is that oftentimes, when the author is trying to push a moral message, they will bend characters in a very unjustified way to suit the moral message. And I think this is what happens to Raskolnikov in this novel. If you don't want spoilers, you might want to skip ahead here, because I'm going to reveal what happens to Raskolnikov at the end of the novel. At the end of the novel, Raskolnikov has a religious awakening, if you like. He converts to Christianity. He sees the light, if you like. Now, the problem that I have with this is that it happens in the epilogue, which is an incredibly short part of the novel, and it just almost comes out of nowhere, really. When it comes to Raskolnikov's conversion to Christianity, he doesn't really seem to be persuaded by any kind of argument, any kind of experience, other than the presence of Sonya, who is a deeply religious woman. This to me is just a bit weak in terms of a motivation. I just don't buy that that's a reason to then change your religious beliefs just because you're in love with someone. It also doesn't help that the epilogue, in comparison to the rest of the novel, is incredibly short and brief. Compare this, say, to the first part of the novel, where you have that incredibly long, slow build-up to the crime, lots of focus on various possible motivations. It really does feel like the crime is really well motivated. Unfortunately, that's less true of this conversion aspect, and I think it would have been better if the novel ended at the end of part 6, when Raskolnikov confesses to the crime. That was a perfect moment to end the novel. There was, even in that moment, somewhat of a recognition that what he did was wrong, even if he didn't go all the way to Christianity with it. But then Dostoevsky wanted to push that moral message in, so he adds this epilogue, which to me isn't very effective in giving the message that he wants. One of the things that made the rest of the novel very effective in terms of its message was that it was well motivated, it was well thought out and structured. That just isn't true in the epilogue, which is where the Christian moralizing comes in, and where I kind of jump off the bandwagon. Sonia is a deeply religious woman, but she's also a prostitute, and that could have made her into a very interesting character with a lot of interesting things to say, but unfortunately she's just a kind of wailing Christian who's just there to motivate Raskolnikov with, her beauty into becoming a Christian. It does let the novel down a little bit for me, because one, I think her character there is a missed opportunity, and two, I think it just leaves a sour taste when the last thing that happens is a very unmotivated conversion to Christianity. So yeah, that is the one weak point in this novel for me. I do think that could have been done better, but overall it's a very, very small one. Part 5. Gothic Atmosphere. Although I don't think it's classed as a Gothic novel by any stretch, Crime and Punishment does feel like one in its atmosphere. There are no supernatural elements to the novel, but Dostoevsky does use several dream sequences, which are very visceral and ethereal and strange, and these give a kind of Gothic supernatural tone to the novel. One of the best ones are the dreams of a guilt-ridden Svidrigailov, who is, like I said, the libertarian villain character, as he is lying alone in this bed in a damp, lonely room towards the end of the novel. That whole sequence as well around the dream is just another example of a really well-crafted scene chronicling the effects of guilt and how they can corrode the mind into insanity. Also, the setting in Russia had a feel of a Gothic novel. There were no big castles or sweeping mountains in the kind of Gothic sublime sense, but the way the city is described, it very much feels like this dark labyrinth of a place where there is just crime going on constantly. There are certain even just small references to other crimes paced throughout the novel. So it has this feeling of constant danger, of darkness and isolation, and it's just so embedded into the way the text is written that you might not even notice it when you read it, but you certainly feel it. I definitely would say that this is somewhat of a Gothic novel, and if you like Gothic novels, I think you'll definitely enjoy this book. Part 6, Conclusion. Crime and Punishment is definitely a fantastic classic, and it's worth reading. It's a great thriller in places, it's got some fantastic characters, and I think that even if you're not a fan of classic novels generally, you will find this to be a page-turner if you give it a try. Even though the Christian moralizing at the end does get on my nerves a little bit, in terms of a response to utilitarianism, those kind of rationalistic moral theories, I think it does a good job. I also think the way it chronicles the effects of grief on a person are great, and as I've just said, the Gothic atmosphere that it has is something I always appreciate in a novel. Okay, that's it for today's video. Please let me know in the comments below what you think of Dostoevsky, and this book in particular if you've read it. Let me know what you'd like to see video-wise in the future. Always looking for new suggestions and ideas, so I'd really appreciate that. Consider subscribing for more content. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday every week. But for now, that's it for me. Take care, guys. I'll see you all in the next video.